It was an interesting process coming to this text because unlike the rest of our wonderful homegrown preachers, I don't generally pick the stories that I'm preaching on. Radhika does that for me. So I open up the Megadoc and see, February 16, I'm preaching on Cain and Abel. Righto, that's the story where one brother kills the other, right? I'm sure I can find something to talk about. And then came the time where I actually got around to reading the text and realised that I may not have ever read it with intention before. I mean, we know the story, or think we know the story, so why would we go back to it? Well, it turns out that I didn't really know the story, or at least I knew a very small portion of it. And the bits that I didn't know have frustrated me endlessly. You might even say that I had a Sunday school understanding of this story, and not in a good way. But the main point of frustration for me is the sparseness of this story, which tends to raise more questions than it answers, and which may well be intentional. We're also wrestling with characters that aren't particularly appealing. We have Abel, who doesn't have much of a role apart from to be killed. Then we have Cain and God, neither of which I'm particularly drawn to. If I'm honest, my first impression of God was that God is a bit of a jerk. It seems a bit inconsistent with how God is portrayed elsewhere or how we imagine God to be. And as it turns out, that's probably true. The first 5 books of the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, is known as the Torah, or the Pentateuch, or the 5 books of Moses. And traditionally it has been understood that Moses was the author of the Torah, which is a little bit tricky, seeing that the Torah records Moses' death. So at the very least, he didn't write all of it. These days, there's an understanding that the Torah is the result of at least 4 different sources being amalgamated together. That is why we have in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, we have 2 distinct creation stories, because they came from different sources. And so when it comes to the story of Cain and Abel, it's generally understood to have come from the Yahwist tradition, named because the author uses the name Yahweh for God. But having these different sources means that there are actually different interpretations or portrayals of God throughout the Torah. And the Yahwist interpretation often goes towards a more anthropomorphized, human characterization of God. And it definitely seems like we're getting that. We have a characterization by God who doesn't seem to be all-knowing. In the story from last week, we have God being unsure as to where Adam and Eve are located within the garden. Similarly, in today's story, God asks Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" This does not seem like the questions of an all-knowing God. And perhaps it's this more human God that makes God's actions irritating within this story. It's a God that leaves me asking the question, why did you do that? But this question is one that effectively permeates the whole of the Hebrew Bible and links to the events of the Babylonian exile. So the Babylonian exile is one of the most significant events in Israel's history, because not only were the Israelites removed from their homeland, but Jerusalem was destroyed, including the temple, the center of Israelite faith and religious practice. Gone. And when your religious and cultural identity is tied to both the temple and your physical location, that is the promised land, what do you do when both those things are gone? This becomes a defining moment for Israel as they ask the questions, who are we? Who are you, God? And perhaps, God, why did you do that? So as we work through the Hebrew Bible this year, it's important that we have some awareness about its composition and formation, because whilst many of these stories have existed for hundreds, if not thousands of years, they were generally held as part of an oral tradition. It wasn't until the Babylonian exile that much of the Old Testament was committed to writing in a form similar to what we have today. And this is really important because it means that the experience of the Babylonian exile has shaped a lot of the content of the Old Testament. And so these texts are, on one level, an exploration of 3 important questions for the Israelites. Who are we? Particularly in light of the exile and the destruction of the temple, who are we as a people? Next, how did we get here? How did God's chosen people end up in exile with our lands destroyed and our temple destroyed? And third, who is God in the midst of all of this? So as we explore the Old Testament together this year as part of our sermon series, I do invite you to keep coming back to these questions. Have them in the back of your mind and see how the stories that we hear might be shaped by this larger story. But back to the story at hand and back to an irritating portrayal of God. As I've wrestled with this text, I've also wrestled with the question, why does God annoy me so much in this passage? And it took a while, but I have come to realize that my annoyance comes from the reality that the portrayal of God hits a little too close to the bone. And that's not to say that God really is a jerk, but rather that God is so often inexplicable. And when God doesn't conform to the picture that I have of God, then irritation ensues. I'm sure we've all experienced this in some form where we've asked the questions, why did God do that? Or where was God in that moment? Or God, why didn't you just do something? And these are the times where our experience of God doesn't conform to the perception of God that we hold. The mystery of God is an important theological concept, but that doesn't mean it can't be damned annoying at the same time. But if we can come to some level of acceptance that we cannot control God, then perhaps we need to move on to think about what we can control, i.e. us, and think about what our human characters in this story have to offer. So both Cain and Abel bring offerings to God, and for unknown reasons, God has regard for Abel's offering, but not Cain, and that really pisses Cain off. God notices and gives Cain a very unusual pep talk. Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. Unfortunately, God neglects to tell Cain how he can do well, or why his precious offering was not regarded, but seems to suggest that if he can just figure it out, things will be good. But I want to focus on that last line a bit more. And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. What does that mean? What sin is God talking about? I might be wrong, but my sense is that this sin is the sin of competition. The sin of valuing self in comparison to the valuing of other. Why does it matter that Abel's offering has regard while Cain's does not? Well, it matters to Cain because he is comparing himself to Abel and identifying himself as inferior. And when we do that, we make the other the problem rather than the system. That's basically capitalism in a nutshell. We are indoctrinated to believe that we are in competition with each other and that my success is dependent on your failure. So we don't question the unjust system. We work to ensure that others fail for our own benefit. That is the sin that is lurking at our door. And unfortunately, instead of our mastering of it, we more often become enslaved to it. But let's turn our attention to Abel just for a moment. It's often suggested that Abel is the ultimate portrayal of innocence. And it's easy to see how you get there. Abel is so limited as a character. He's born, he keeps sheep, he gives an offering to God, he is killed. But the idea of his innocence is an interesting one. Is there no sin lurking at his door? Is he somehow different to Cain, who is certainly more fleshed out as a character? Now, this becomes a delicate path for us to explore because at its extreme, we move into the realm of victim blaming where Abel is somehow responsible for his own murder, and I'm certainly not wanting us to go there. But the reality is that we are all beings of action and inaction. We choose when to engage or not. And whether or not this God's system of regard is unjust or not, Cain certainly felt that it was, and Abel was the beneficiary of it. I wonder if the sin of Abel is complacency. Now, there is a very real possibility that I'm projecting something onto Abel that is entirely unfair, but I do believe that the sin of complacency is real nonetheless. Alice Walker once said, "The most common way people give up their power is by thinking that they don't have any." And in a similar vein, Martin Luther King Jr. said, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." This is important for those of us who experience privilege, whether it be from our gender or our background or leadership positions or social status, that our sin is sometimes doing nothing. If and when we have power, and we all have power sometimes, to not use it for the good of our neighbour, that is sin. That is us turning away from God. But back to Cain, though, who, as we have mentioned, becomes enslaved to the sin of competition, goes to the extreme of eliminating his perceived competition. He takes Abel away and he kills him. And when God questions Abel, where Abel is, Cain offers the chilling response, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" Whew. Honestly, I didn't really think much about this line when I first read the story, but coming back to it after thinking about the sin of competition stuff, this hits differently. This hits harder. Because once again, Cain embodies the sin of competition, shows his enslavement to it. Cain is his own man, an individual who's not responsible for others, despite the fact that he's just killed someone. It doesn't matter how we get to the top, how many people we step on the way. The end justifies the means. Now, Cain's response is certainly rhetorical. He's not looking for an answer to the question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" But this, and questions like it, should always be answered. And the answer should be yes. As soon as we place a barrier between us and the other, we are no longer the same, and we will assume a position of superiority. We see it in the rise of Christian nationalism. We see it in the rise of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And we all have to be cautious because it is way too easy for us to find ourselves creating and reinforcing such divisions without even knowing it. We began by thinking about the nature of God in this story, so let's end there as well. On the surface, God's punishment might seem harsh, but in the context of time, I believe it's a response of grace. You may be familiar with the phrase, "an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." This idea appears 3 times in the Torah, once each in Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy. In Leviticus it reads, "Anyone who maims another shall suffer the same injury in return. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The injury inflicted is the injury to be suffered." Now on the surface this would seem like a mandate for revenge, for retaliation. If you hurt me, I can hurt you in return. And so we can't escape the violence of this idea, but if we look a little closer, we can begin to see that there is even an element of justice here. Hear it again with some added emphasis. Anyone who maims another shall suffer the same injury in return. Only fracture for fracture, only eye for eye, only tooth for tooth. The injury inflicted is the injury to be suffered. What this law does then is to limit violence. It limits retaliation. If I am harmed by you, I cannot respond by harming you more, and then harming your family, and then harming your business and your village. I am limited to responding only in kind. At its theoretical best, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth is about concluding conflict. But just as Jesus pushes against this even further, it pushes back even this idea of equitable violence, it would seem that God does the same in this story. Because surely the correct punishment for Cain is to lose his life. Take a life, lose a life. But not to God in this story. Whilst God does send Cain away, God does not kill or harm him. On the contrary, God speaks a word of protection over Cain. It seems that even when we can't quite get a handle on what God is up to, we can still see glimpses of God's grace and God's mercy shine through. And as we wrestle with the sins of competition and complacency in our own lives, that we might master them instead of being enslaved to them, to see those glimpses of grace and mercy might just be the thing we need to keep us going. Now that's pretty much the end of the story for Cain, except for the continuation of a pattern of disobedience that began last week with the story of Adam and Eve. In this case, whilst Cain's punishment was to become a wanderer, he chooses to disobey God once again and settles in the land of Nod. This repetition of disobedience continues throughout the Hebrew Bible and will be a feature of many of the stories that we encounter this year. So stay tuned. I like the idea of ending a sermon on a cliffhanger. In the name of God, who is mystery. Amen.